In this video, I'm going to be comparing the PodTrak P4 that I have right here to the Rødecaster Pro in terms of its feature set, as well as some considerations that you might want to make when deciding between these two podcast recorders. Now, for full disclosure, the PodTrak P4 that I have right here was sent to me by Sound Service GmbH in Germany. This is a loaner device, and I'm going to be sending this back as soon as I am done making these videos. This is an honest review, honest comparison, as this video will not be sent to the company before it goes live. So this is all that I want to say about this device and how I want to compare it to the Rødecaster Pro in this video. I also have a full playlist of videos about the PodTrak P4 linked in the description below, as well as up here in the info corner. Now, where do we start out here? First off, I would say these recorders are obviously made for podcast purposes as well as live streaming to an extent. And they both also have integrations for remote guests as well as local guests with proper XLR-based microphones. So that's the baseline. These recorders are not necessarily made for any type of high quality recording in terms of music recording or stuff like that. However, you could certainly use them for that as well. But there are certain limitations to both of these devices in that regard, and they are definitely mostly made for the purpose of recording podcasts, and that's obvious by their name as well. Now, to start out with a baseline here, the price on these two devices is vastly different. Now, the Zoom PodTrak P4 costs about $200 and the Rødecaster Pro costs $599 as of this recording. Now, that's a difference of $400, and considering you also need microphones, headphones, as well as some cables, that makes the PodTrak a really interesting choice just based on the pricing. For example, if you want to go with the Rode Pod mic as your microphones, you could get two microphones for $100 each. You could also include two headphones for, let's say, $50, and then get a couple cables, and all of that would still be cheaper than the Rødecaster Pro just by itself without any microphones and everything else. So from a price standpoint, the PodTrak P4 definitely takes the cake and gets this point. The next big difference is size and weight. With the PodTrak, we are talking about 290 grams, and with the Rødecaster, we are talking about 1.98 kilograms. So that's huge in terms of that difference, and the Rødecaster is something you don't really want to carry around for a long time. You don't want to take that on a trip. So this here is not even a quarter of the size or a quarter of the weight. It's like 1/8 of the weight, and you get a lot of features that the Rødecaster also has in a much, much smaller package. And the funny thing is that the Rødecaster actually features a micro SD card port, and this recorder, the PodTrak, actually has a full-sized SD card port, which supports SD cards up to 512 gigabytes. So with that, you will probably never run out of space for audio recording. So this point in terms of weight and dimensions is definitely going for the PodTrak, unless of course you like the haptics of the Rødecaster better with the faders and stuff like that, where here you only have these dials to kind of like dial in your volume for the headphones and also the volume of the XLR ports. Now let's talk about a couple of the similarities and of course also their differences in each category. Starting out with the XLR ports. And as you can see here on the PodTrak P4, we have 4 XLR ports, which are non-locking. So they don't have any clamp, and I could just yank this cable out and the microphone would disconnect. Now, as a demonstration, the Rødecaster Pro features locking mechanisms for this, like this Zoom F6 has. And you can see there is a little button right there at the top, and you have to press this to actually be able to remove this cable here, for example, and only then you can unplug it. So that's a small but maybe significant feature that the Rødecaster has over the PodTrak. However, the more important difference in terms of its XLR ports on the Rodecaster versus the PodTrak is that the PodTrak actually loses XLR ports as you use the integration for phone call or for USB audio. With the Rødecaster, on the other hand, you have dedicated channels for the phone integration as well as the USB integration for remote calls, audio playing back on your computer and similar things, whereas on the PodTrak there are these capabilities as well, and we're talking about those in a second. However, they are mapped to ports 3 and 4. So for example, if you are using this with 3 people in your studio, you can choose between having a remote integration via USB or via a phone call with the TRRS connection or the Bluetooth connection. However, then of course you will only be able to use 3 XLR ports, and if you want to use your phone integration as well as the USB integration, you will only be able to use 2 local XLR microphones. However, of course, if you don't use any of those features, then you can use the full 4 XLR ports on the PodTrak P4. So in terms of the XLR connectivity, the Rødecaster Pro takes this point. It has 4 always functional XLR ports with locking mechanism, and that's definitely a plus. However, if you just want to use this for certain circumstances and you know that you're not going to need 4 podcast microphones in addition with remote calls and all of that, then the PodTrak is a great choice. The next point on my list are the headphone ports, and on the PodTrak we have these 4 mini jack headphone ports, and each one of them has an individual volume control. This is really practical when you, for example, have these Soundpads activated and you have playback there, or you have remote calls and everybody can hear the remote call as well as everybody else. One thing to note here is that with the PodTrak, everything that is recorded is also output to all 4 connections. So there's no mix minus for these headphone ports. However, there is a mix minus feature for the remote call integration as well as the USB integration. And if you want to learn more about that, there is going to be a video specifically about the phone integration as well as the mix minus feature of the PodTrak linked in the description below in that playlist that I mentioned in the beginning. Now, in comparison, the Rødecaster Pro features 5 headphone outputs. It has 1 headphone output for each individual XLR port, and in addition to that, there is some kind of a host connection at the front of the Rødecaster, which gives you the total mix. So you have up to 5 connections for headphones, and those are actually 6.3 millimeter stereo jack connections. So they are the bigger connectors and not just these normal mobile phone connectors for your headphones. This 5th connection on the Rødecaster Pro might be useful, for example, in those cases where you have 4 people talking as well as 1 person dedicated for mixing the podcast. Now, the next feature on my list are the Soundpads. In this case, again, both of the devices feature Soundpads. However, the PodTrak P4 only features 4 Soundpads, and the Rødecaster Pro features up to 8 Soundpads. These Soundpads are incredibly useful, for example, if you want to finish your production right there and then with intros and outros and all of that already integrated. You can also use these for sound effect integration, and my personal preference would be to integrate some kind of voice messages or listener questions that are pre-recorded so that you can play them back on this device and have people react to those messages or audios. So that's a really cool feature that both of these feature, and of course 4 on the PodTrak and 8 on the Rødecaster. An important point about these Soundpads is that you have full control over the volume on the Soundpad control right here on the PodTrak, and you also have similar faders on the Rødecaster, which let you control the volume of those Soundpads that you are playing in. The last important point about Soundpads is also an interesting point about the recording ability on both of these devices, and that is that the Soundpads as well as each individual track is going to be recorded into its own file, and on the Rødecaster you can also choose a WAV poly file, which is just one file which includes all of the different tracks. And both of these also output one stereo mixdown. So if you wanted to, you could just take that stereo mixdown, convert it to a MP3 file or an AAC, and provide it for your podcast hosting solution, and you are good to go with your intros, with the Soundpads already integrated and all of that. However, you still have the flexibility to also have each individual track so that you can bring those into your audio editing program and make adjustments there after the fact. But with that, we are also talking about recording formats and also the sound effects or the basic processing, sound processing on these devices. And there are a couple of very notable differences. Most notably is that the Rødecaster definitely takes the cake in the department of sound processing on the device. It has way more capabilities than the PodTrak, where the PodTrak only features a limiter as well as a low-cut filter, and you can individually enable and disable this for the different XLR ports. The Rødecaster has way more. You have EQ, you have limiters, you have de-essers, you also have a oral exciter, which is a kind of funky way of just making your podcast microphones sound better. And you also have ducking as well as a couple of more features available in your settings. There also, the Rødecaster has a way bigger screen to make all of those settings. On the PodTrak, however, I personally am really surprised as to how good the limiter sounds compared to, for example, the H5. I have made a video where I compared these two devices because they're in a similar price range, the Zoom H5 and the PodTrak P4. And I have to say I am blown away as to what they were able to do in this small packaging, being able to basically not clip the signal, and you can't even hear that, or basically can't hear when the signal is clipping. So that's really helpful there. However, you should still make sure to set your levels right on both of these devices, and that has a lot to do with the recording format. Because in this case, the PodTrak records in 16-bit and 44.1 kilohertz, and the Rødecaster actually records in 24-bit with 48 kilohertz. Now that might not sound like a strong difference, however, it definitely can be a very strong difference if you are specifically looking into the post-processing of your show. The 16-bit and 44.1 kilohertz of the PodTrak can be absolutely enough, specifically if you are doing voice recordings only or mostly. Something like an intro music tingle or something like that will be totally fine. However, as you take this into your editing program and you want to make more adjustments, you're more likely to experience noise and similar things with the PodTrak P4, whereas the 24-bit and 48 kilohertz on the Rødecaster are kind of more future-proof, as well as they give you more dynamic range in the post-processing. Something to note here is that both of these devices don't support 32-bit floating point audio, even though that is becoming more and more popular, like with this Zoom F6, for example. However, as I also described in my video about 32-bit floating point audio, this may not be a case where you actually want 32-bit floating point audio. And the main reason for this is that you are probably going to try to finish your podcast right on the device that you have in front of you, be it the PodTrak or the Rødecaster. So the 24-bit or 16-bit audio will be mostly finished by the time you bring it to your computer for publishing. And in an ideal scenario, if you want to, you can completely finish your file on the device with the effects that you have available to you, and then bring it over, just convert it and publish it. So that's definitely a plus here. Whereas with a 32-bit floating point audio recorder, you have much more post-processing. And for me, I even find that there are good reasons to use 24-bit modes on something like the F6. For example, when you want to dial in your settings and just record your finished product right then and there. But when it gets to it, the Rødecaster gives you a better file in terms of its audio recording than the PodTrak, but the PodTrak also gives you a surprisingly good result despite having just 16-bit and 44.1 kilohertz. Now, there are also these integrations with USB, for example, and both of these can be used as USB interfaces on your computer as well as on your mobile devices. On the PodTrak, you actually have two USB-C connections, one for powering the device and the other to have a data connection and also to power the device if your device on the other end can handle that. This is really useful because as you plug this in, the PodTrak becomes a kind of like a sound card input and output. So you can use this as your microphone. For example, for me, I could use the Shure Beta 57A connected to the PodTrak and then connect that via USB to my computer. And I can use this for Skype calls and similar things. In addition to that, I can also choose this to be the output so that the sound from the computer is going to be output to the PodTrak. And with that, I can continue to record the audio that is coming from there. For example, in a Zoom call or a Skype conversation. So that's really, really practical and is something that is also possible on the Rødecaster. The Rødecaster has one advantage over the PodTrak here, and that is that the Rødecaster also features multi-track recording, where the PodTrak only features a stereo output. So the PodTrak only will ever output all of the inputs here, mix it down, and send it to your computer, where the Rødecaster, you can record each individual track individually on your computer, in addition to also being able to choose the stereo track. But you have to choose between these two modes, so it's either multi-track mode or it's stereo mode. Something to note here with the PodTrak that I found out is that it actually has a USB-C mix-minus feature, which basically means that you can send audio to the recorder and it is recorded into the channel 4 here when you have activated it into that channel. And you then also can send back everything else back to the computer, but the computer will not hear itself. So you can reduce the risk of any feedback loops and stuff like that. That is specifically interesting if you are doing something like, for example, a Skype call integration, because the person on the other end does not need to hear themselves. That would not make any sense. So this is why the mix-minus feature is really interesting here. However, you can disable it for the USB-C port. So that's really useful when you do want to record the full mix on your computer, but also, for example, have a computer-based Soundpad that sends audio to this device. On the Rødecaster, I'm not 100% sure how the mix-minus feature works. I don't have it right now here to test all of these details, so that's why I'm leaving it kind of open here. I'm pretty sure there is a mix-minus feature, and that will probably work similar to the one here in the PodTrak. The cool thing about these USB-C interfaces is that you can actually use these recorders as live streaming mixers as well, so that you can either choose to live stream your recording whilst you are doing it, or maybe you use your computer to record the video of your interview or something like that. So that's something that is really, really helpful here, and you can just mix your audio here, put it onto your computer via USB, and then, for example, use it in OBS for live streaming to YouTube, Twitch, or whatever you might have. Now, these were the points that I wanted to share with you today about the Rødecaster Pro in comparison to the Zoom PodTrak P4. I think it's remarkable what the PodTrak P4 does for the money, so that's definitely a big point for it. However, if you want to have other features that only the Rødecaster has, maybe you need that upgrade. Now, which device would I recommend for you as the person watching? Now, of course, here it depends on what your specific use case is, as well as your specific budget. If you are tight on a budget, I think there's pretty much no other choice than to go with the PodTrak P4. But it is really powerful that something like this is now on the market, because this is something that was only possible specifically with that many connectors and so on for a couple $100 more in this type of quality. I think it's really mind-blowing that they were able to package all of this into this little device. Now, if you know that you need 4 XLR ports and you also want the phone and computer integrations working at the same time, then the PodTrak is, of course, not for you. This is just for you if you know that you have either 4 people in person or 2 or 3 people in person, plus remote call integration as well as USB audio. And of course, the PodTrak only has 4 Soundpads, whereas the Rødecaster has 8 of them. and also more advanced sound processing. So basically, if you are on a budget and you know that 4 channels are enough for you, then the PodTrak is your choice. And of course, also if you want to carry it around more, because this is absolute no-brainer. This is so light, so tiny. It's a really, really cool device. With the Rødecaster, on the other hand, that's more the device that I would recommend for you if you want to upgrade your gear, if you want to build your home studio podcasting set, which is not really going to move anywhere, and you really want to have a really powerful, complete setup. That's where I would go for the Rødecaster Pro. That's a device for that kind of studio environment. And I think that actually these two can be a really interesting combination, for example, for that purpose of having your home studio where you have the Rødecaster Pro set up, and then you have this as a mobile studio for those times where you are actually moving out and about and you just want to bring a small recorder like this. Now, personally, if I had to choose between the PodTrak and the Rødecaster, I would probably go with the PodTrak simply because of its size and price. This is so much packed into a small package, it's unbelievable, and specifically for me, because I also want to be able to go to my guests in my podcast show, that is definitely a better device. Now, my personal use case is more geared towards something like the Zoom F6, which I'm going to compare in a specific video as well to the PodTrak P4, because I really like the 32-bit floating point audio. However, the Zoom F6 is even more expensive than the Rødecaster Pro, so that's definitely something to also keep in mind, but the comparisons will come there as well. So that's it for today's video. I hope this comparison was interesting and helpful for you to get to know the PodTrak in comparison with the Rødecaster Pro. Now, if there are any questions left, maybe they are answered in one of the other videos, which I will have linked in the description down below with my playlist about the PodTrak P4. And if there are any more questions, then you can leave those in the comment section down below. There I will try to answer you, but also please know that I'm not going to be having the PodTrak on hands when these videos are done, because this is just a loaner and I'm going to ship this back. There's also a shout out to Sound Services GmbH, which were kind enough to provide this device for me so that I could make these videos for you. Now, if you enjoyed this video or if it was helpful in any way, please give it a thumbs up. That helps out a lot with the YouTube algorithm so that other people may find these videos as well. And of course, it helps me to know better what kind of videos you like. And if you want to see more of these videos, you can also subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And of course, hit the bell icon so that you are going to be notified whenever I publish a new video. Now, with all of that said, I hope you have an amazing day, make it your life, and create your podcast. Ciao, ciao.